History has a pattern. Women who challenge the world are often labeled something first. Too loud, too emotional, too dangerous, too much. And sometimes history changes its mind. So today, I want to talk about one of the most extraordinary examples of that pattern, Joan of Arc. So Joan of Arc was a teenage peasant girl who led armies and then was executed as a heretic. But history now recognizes her as a saint. So let's talk about Joan of Arc a little bit. So she was born around 1412 in a small village in France. And at that time, France was in the middle of their 100-Year War with England. And it was a super brutal conflict that had already lasted generations. And the world that Joan grew up in was extremely rigid. Women were expected to marry, to run households, and to basically obey male authority. Leading an army wasn't even remotely imaginable, especially for a teenage peasant girl. But Joan said something remarkable happened to her when she was about 13 years old. She began hearing voices, and she claimed that these voices belonged to saints. So St. Michael, St. Catherine, St. Margaret. And according to Joan, those voices had given her a mission, which was to help save France. Now imagine in the 1400s hearing a teenage girl saying that God has chosen her to lead a war. To some people, that might have sounded divine, but to other people, it sounded extremely dangerous. And yet, somehow, she convinced people to listen to her. And just 17 years old, Joan managed to meet the future King of France. And she persuaded him to let her accompany the army. She wore armor, she rode with soldiers, and in 1429, she helped to lift the siege of Orleans, which is one of the most important turning points of that war. But success didn't protect her. And in 1430, Joan was captured, and the English, along with their allies, decided to put her on trial. Not for military crimes, but for something else. And that something else was heresy. So, the trial of Joan of Arc is one of the most fascinating in legal records in history because transcripts of her interrogation still exist to this day. And for months, she was questioned by these highly educated theologians who were trying to trap her, to force her to admit she was making it all up, or that she was possessed, or she was an insane. And remarkably, she responded throughout calmly, directly, and sometimes even brilliantly. At one point, they asked her a trick question, and they asked if she believed that she was in God's grace. And if she said yes, it could be considered as arrogance. But if she said no, then clearly it implied guilt. So, posed with this question, Joan responded, "If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God keep me there." And even the judges were stunned by her responses. But this trial was never really about truth, it was about power. Joan had disrupted the political order. And eventually, inevitably, the court declared her guilty. And in 1431, just 19 years old, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake. And for centuries, that could have been the end of the story. a girl who had been perceived as strange and claimed she had visions and died for it. But thankfully, history wasn't finished with Joan. And just 25 years later, the church actually reopened her case. Witnesses were interviewed again, and the trial was re-examined. And the conclusion, especially in those days, we're talking the 1400s here, was absolutely extraordinary. The original trial was found to have been corrupt, and Joan was declared innocent. Too late for them to bring her back to life. However, centuries later, she was actually canonized as a saint. So this raises a fascinating question. How did this same woman go from a heretic to being exonerated to becoming a saint? And the answer may have less to do with Joan and more to do with the way that societies interpret behavior. So let's get into looking at Joan through a different lens. And we're going to look at this through the lens of today's historians and psychologists who acknowledge, as do we all, we cannot diagnose historical figures as being neurodivergent or having a specific type of mental illness. All we can go on are the records that are there and the information we have about the person as is written in history. But what we can do is we can ask some new questions. For example, her extraordinary conviction, her independence from social hierarchy. I mean, this was a girl that came from poverty, right? And went on to lead armies. Her willingness to ignore rigid gender roles, her direct communication style, her intense sense of mission. And some researchers suggest that these traits resemble cognitive profiles that we may now associate with neurodivergence. Whereas others explore neurological explanations for the voices that she reported. And still others believe that she experienced genuine religious mystical states. And the truth is, we actually just can't know. But what we can see clearly is this, that in Joan's time, there were only a few ways to interpret behavior like hers: divine or dangerous. And that's what makes Joan of Arc such a powerful example of this pattern. This pattern where society labels a woman way before it understands her: too loud, too emotional, too much, too ambitious, too like a man, too whatever it is, right? Until history catches up. Joan of Arc didn't change. The story about her did. And that's the question that this series keeps asking, is how many people throughout history were misunderstood simply because the world didn't yet have the language to understand them. Sometimes that same world condemns a woman that condemns a woman is the one that later builds statues in her honor, as we do now for Joan of Arc. So I want to leave you with this question, which is, what have you been told you're too much of in life that is actually one of your strengths? And we'd love for you to share your thoughts in the comments and share this podcast and hashtag formally too much, because it's about time we stopped waiting for history to catch up with the brilliant ideas of the women that exist within it. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for joining me. Bye.